Maze Prison. December 27th, 1997. Billy Wright sits in the back of a prison van, waiting to be moved for a visit. Minutes later, gunfire shatters the silence. 3 INLA gunmen strike with precision, leaving Wright dead inside one of the most secure prisons in the world. To his followers, he was a man of faith and conviction, a loyalist who never surrendered. To his enemies, he was the symbol of violence and division. His death sent shockwaves through Northern Ireland, not just because of who he was, but because of where it happened. How did the son of a born-again preacher become the most feared loyalist leader of his generation? The story begins long before that van door closed. Billy Wright's rise through the loyalist ranks was built on defiance. By the late 1980s, he had become a prominent figure within the Ulster volunteer force, the UVF, known for his discipline, his unwavering loyalty to the Protestant cause, and his willingness to act when others hesitated. But that same intensity soon turned against the organization that shaped him. When the UVF's leadership began moving toward a ceasefire, Wright rejected the idea entirely. He saw compromise as betrayal, believing peace talks diluted everything loyalists had fought for. His refusal to obey orders led to his expulsion in 1996, an act that, instead of silencing him, gave birth to something new. From the outskirts of Portadown, Wright formed the Loyalist Volunteer Force, the LVF. He presented it as the true voice of militant loyalism, untainted by politics or negotiation. To his followers, Wright was a man of conviction, fearless, uncompromising, almost prophetic in tone. They called him King Rat, a nickname he neither denied nor discouraged. To rival loyalist leaders, he was dangerous, a fanatic, willing to tear the movement apart for his own crusade. His speeches mixed religion with ideology, painting the conflict as a holy struggle between faith and treachery. Within months, the LVF became both a symbol and a threat, admired by those who shared Wright's vision, despised by those who saw him as a man pushing Northern Ireland back into chaos. It was this division, loyalty and revulsion intertwined, that defined his rise and set the stage for his eventual downfall. As Wright's influence grew, his beliefs hardened into something far more extreme. What began as loyalty to the crown evolved into a kind of religious crusade, one that blurred politics, prophecy, and paranoia. He became fascinated by the idea that Northern Ireland's conflict was part of a larger spiritual war. Through the early 1990s, Wright began corresponding with American evangelical groups on the far right, drawing inspiration from their militant sermons and anti-communist rhetoric. He adopted their language of moral purity, describing his enemies not just as political opponents, but as agents of evil. To him, compromise wasn't just weakness, it was sin. These views found new strength through his association with Combat 18, a neo-Nazi organization based in England. Though publicly denied, members of both movements admired his defiance and saw him as a natural ally. For Wright, it was validation, proof that his struggle had meaning beyond Northern Ireland. Religion became his weapon. He quoted scripture as justification for revenge, interpreting biblical passages as divine support for loyalist violence. His faith no longer called for forgiveness, only for vengeance. In his mind, he wasn't a terrorist or a murderer. He was a soldier chosen for a holy cause, and it was this conviction that would soon isolate him completely. When Billy Wright was expelled from the UVF in 1996, it wasn't the end of his influence. It was the beginning of something far more volatile. Within weeks, he formed his own group, the Loyalist Volunteer Force, or LVF. He presented it as a movement for true loyalists, men unwilling to accept peace with Republicans or compromise with politicians. To Wright, the official ceasefire meant surrender, and surrender was unforgivable. The LVF was small at first, no more than a few hundred men, but fiercely loyal. Many were drawn from mid-Ulster, where Wright's reputation carried the weight of legend. They saw him not as a criminal, but as a man betrayed by his own side, a leader standing alone against political betrayal and spiritual decay. His codename inside the movement was Covenant, a reference to the solemn pledge of Protestant unity dating back to the 17th century. It reflected both his belief in divine purpose and his sense of personal destiny. The group operated outside all formal structures of the loyalist paramilitaries. That isolation gave Wright complete control. He dictated its aims, its tone, and its enemies. The LVF declared its purpose in direct, uncompromising terms to protect the Protestant people and oppose all enemies of Ulster by any means necessary. In reality, that meant a campaign of targeted shootings, intimidation, and retribution, mostly against Catholics, but occasionally against other loyalists who stood in Wright's way. Their propaganda was steeped in religious language and militaristic imagery. Statements from the LVF were signed off with phrases like, "For God and Ulster," and "No surrender." The group released leaflets quoting scripture beside threats of violence, merging faith and fear into a single message. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was spiritual war. Wright used every public appearance to reinforce that idea, describing his actions as obedience to God's will, not to any party or leader. The LVF's presence was most visible in Portadown and the surrounding areas, particularly during the Drumcree conflict, a tense annual standoff between Protestant marchers and Catholic residents. Wright became the face of that confrontation, often appearing at the front lines, delivering defiant statements that fueled both admiration and hatred. The media labeled him King Rat, but his followers wore the name as a badge of honor. Despite the growing pressure from police, the LVF expanded quickly. Intelligence reports estimated their membership between 150 and 300 armed men, though their network of sympathizers was much wider. They operated independently of the combined Loyalist military command, the umbrella group overseeing the main Loyalist factions, and they rejected all attempts at negotiation. The LVF carried out multiple attacks even after the 1994 ceasefire, defying both political momentum and public fatigue. They targeted individuals linked to Republican groups, claiming these were defensive actions. But many of the killings appeared arbitrary, acts of revenge or assertion of control. For every operation, the LVF released a formal statement, typed and signed, often referencing biblical punishment. Each killing was presented not as murder, but as divine justice. By 1997, Wright's relationship with other Loyalist leaders had deteriorated beyond repair. The UVF and UDA leadership viewed him as a liability, a man whose defiance threatened to undo years of political effort. Yet within his stronghold, Wright's power remained absolute. His followers treated him as untouchable, even prophetic. He controlled their loyalty through a mix of fear, faith, and charisma. Still, the isolation was growing. The LVF had no allies, no political arm, and no future in peace talks. Wright was trapped inside his own creation, a leader without compromise, commanding an army built on defiance. Every new act of violence brought the same question closer. How long could one man stand against the tide of history before it swallowed him whole? Behind the walls of the Maze prison, Billy Wright refused to fade into silence. His arrest did not end his command, it relocated it. Even in a cell, he ran the Loyalist volunteer force as if the fences and guards were irrelevant. Messages left the compound in coded letters and whispered orders, keeping the LVF structure alive on the outside. Wright's control rested not on proximity, but fear. He issued threats to rivals, orchestrated attacks, and demanded loyalty from followers who believed his authority came from something greater than politics, almost divine conviction. Prison became his fortress, not his cage. The same charisma that had once rallied armed men now created an aura of martyrdom among Loyalists who saw him as the embodiment of their struggle. But the deeper Wright sank into isolation, the more his thoughts hardened into prophecy. He became convinced that powerful forces, the British government, the prison authorities, and Republican factions were conspiring to eliminate him. He spoke of betrayal as inevitable, of enemies operating through secret channels. To the outside world, he remained a prisoner. Inside, he was a self-declared commander, issuing orders from confinement and preparing for an ending he believed was written long before his capture. The paranoia grew, feeding on real tensions and imagined plots. In his mind, Death was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty, a final act of collusion between state and enemy that would seal his transformation from paramilitary leader to martyr. On the morning of 27 December 1997, Billy Wright stepped into a prison van inside the Maze's H Block 6. He was due to visit his girlfriend. The routine was familiar, the same escort, the same brief journey across the compound. But within minutes, the ordinary turned lethal. 3 Republican prisoners from the Irish National Liberation Army, Christopher McWilliams, John Glennon and John Kennaway, had prepared for weeks. Their cell overlooked the route used by loyalist inmates. They observed the schedule, noted the guards' positions, and cut through a wire fence with tools smuggled in. Behind the wall, they built a hole large enough to fire through. The weapons, 2 revolvers, had been hidden inside the block, past several layers of security. At approximately 10:10 a.m., as Wright's van came to a halt, the attackers moved. One shouted his name. As Wright turned his head, 6 shots were fired. He was hit repeatedly in the chest and head, dying instantly in the driver's seat. The gunmen stepped back and dropped their weapons. They made no attempt to flee. "That's for the LVF," one said, as they were restrained. The entire attack lasted less than 60 seconds. The scene defied logic. A leading loyalist paramilitary assassinated inside one of the most secure prisons in Europe by his enemies, under the watch of the state. Questions began before his body was even removed. How did the INLA know Wright's movements? How did firearms pass through multiple searches? Why were Republican and Loyalist prisoners housed within firing distance of each other? An inquiry followed. The report concluded that severe operational failures had allowed the killing. A guard failed to follow procedures. Intelligence warnings about threats to Wright's life were ignored. The men responsible were later convicted of murder, yet their actions were treated as a symbolic strike, a final act of war carried out in peacetime. For Wright's supporters, the murder confirmed his prophecy. He had long claimed that the government and Republicans were colluding to silence him. To them, his death inside a state-controlled facility proved it. Within hours, loyalist groups threatened revenge. Riots flared in Portadown. LVF graffiti declared him a martyr. Inside the maze, the aftermath was chillingly calm. The killers issued statements describing Wright as an enemy combatant. They said they acted to punish sectarian murder. Outside, politicians condemned the breach of security, but in Northern Ireland's divided narrative, condemnation was never universal. To some, Wright's death was retribution. To others, it was betrayal by the system that had once empowered him. In the end, the maze became the stage for the inevitability he had foreseen, the merging of paranoia and reality. The man who believed he would die through collusion was killed in precisely that environment. Not by accident, not in chaos, but through a sequence so calculated that even his enemies seemed to perform the role he had scripted for them. His death closed a chapter of loyalist extremism, but opened a deeper wound. Proof that even within the state's highest walls, Northern Ireland's war was not finished. It had simply found a new battleground. The reaction to Billy Wright's killing was immediate and violent. Within hours, the Loyalist Volunteer Force launched a series of retaliatory attacks across Northern Ireland, targeting Catholic civilians. The Ulster Defence Association followed with its own wave of shootings, declaring Wright's death an act of war. In the space of days, the fragile peace that followed the ceasefires began to fracture. Wright's funeral drew thousands. Streets in Portadown filled with loyalists carrying flags and black armbands. His coffin, draped in the red hand of Ulster, was carried by masked men in paramilitary uniform. Reporters were kept at a distance. Cameras were banned. The atmosphere was heavy, militarized, almost ceremonial in its defiance. To his followers, Wright was no longer a man. He was proof of betrayal, the loyalist who stood unbending against the peace process and was silenced for it. His image, printed on banners and murals, became a rallying symbol for those unwilling to surrender their fight. The state buried a prisoner. His supporters buried a martyr. And in that divide, Northern Ireland's war, supposedly over, found a new reason to keep breathing. The killing of Billy Wright inside the Maze prison demanded an explanation. How could one of the most heavily monitored inmates in Britain's highest security facility be executed by his sworn enemies without intervention? The question refused to fade. In 2005, under sustained political and public pressure, a formal public inquiry was announced, one of several established under the Northern Ireland peace process to examine historic cases of alleged collusion. The inquiry cost more than 30 million pounds and took 6 years to complete. Its mandate was clear: determine whether prison officers, intelligence agencies or government bodies had played any role, direct or indirect, in Wright's death. Evidence painted a picture of extraordinary failure. On the morning of December 27, 1997, 3 members of the Irish National Liberation Army, Christopher McWilliams, John Glennon and John Kennaway, left their cell block carrying a homemade pistol. They scaled the internal fence separating the Republican and Loyalist wings and intercepted Wright as he was driven to a visiting area. Within seconds, 6 shots were fired. The gunmen surrendered immediately. The operation had taken place inside one of the most secure prisons in Europe. What emerged during the inquiry was not a conspiracy in the conventional sense, but a chain of astonishing oversights. The internal gate separating the wings had been left open. The alarm system malfunctioned. Guards failed to respond in time. Intelligence suggesting that Wright's life was under threat had been recorded but not acted upon. Investigators from the inquiry, chaired by Lord Maclean, concluded that there was no direct evidence of state collusion in Wright's murder. Yet they also stated that systemic negligence and poor management had created the conditions that allowed it to happen. In plain terms, the system did not kill him, but it made his killing possible. Despite this conclusion, the report did little to quiet suspicion. Within Loyalist circles, Wright's death was seen as proof of betrayal, a convenient elimination of a man too extreme for a peace process that required Loyalist compliance. Wright had spoken openly of his belief that the government and Republican groups were working together to silence him. His prophecy, in the eyes of his supporters, had been fulfilled. Adding to the intrigue were persistent rumors of Wright's own alleged intelligence links. Former associates claimed he had once been registered as a special branch informant under the codename Bertie. The claim was never proven, and the inquiry found no documentation verifying his supposed role as an agent. Still, the allegation endured. For Republicans, it suggested Wright had been used and discarded by the state. For Loyalists, it implied betrayal from within. The inquiry also examined the role of the Northern Ireland Prison Service, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the Security Service, MI5. It found critical gaps in communication between agencies, intelligence reports that stopped at middle management, risk assessments that were never updated, and security reviews ignored by senior officials. The system had treated Wright as both a prisoner and a political liability. The result was paralysis. No one wanted responsibility for his protection, yet no one would authorize his removal to a safer unit. The report's language was restrained but devastating. It called the Maze prison's command structure fragmented, ineffective, and incapable of managing rival paramilitary factions. It noted that warning signs had been visible for months, yet the culture of complacency inside the prison had allowed the threat to be dismissed. By the time the inquiry delivered its final report in 2010, the political landscape of Northern Ireland had transformed. The Maze itself had closed. The LVF had splintered and faded. But the shadow of Wright's death persisted, a symbol, myth, and unresolved accusation. To his followers, the inquiry's conclusions proved what they already believed, that justice in Northern Ireland was selective. To his opponents, it confirmed something darker, that men like Wright had been sustained by a system willing to tolerate violence when convenient. The official record says there was no collusion. The historical memory says otherwise. Between those two versions lies the lasting ambiguity of Billy Wright's end, a killing that exposed not just the cracks in a prison, but the fractures in a country still learning how to tell the truth about itself. death did not erase Billy Wright. It remade him. In the years after his assassination, his image spread across loyalist strongholds, painted on gable walls, etched into tattoos, printed on banners carried through Portadown and Lurgan. The face was always the same: square jaw, cold eyes, defiant stare. Below it, the words King Rat, a title once whispered in fear, now turned into a badge of loyalty. Murals appeared in the estates where the LVF had drawn its followers. They showed Wright standing against storm clouds or framed by the red hand of Ulster. Some called him a soldier of God. Others compared him to a prophet, a man who warned of betrayal and paid for it with his life. Memorial marches were held every December. Flowers were laid at makeshift shrines, sometimes guarded by masked men who still used his name as a pledge. His cult grew because it offered simplicity in a divided world. For loyalists disillusioned by the peace process, Wright represented purity, unyielding, unapologetic, unbroken by compromise. He was the symbol of resistance to political surrender, the embodiment of defiance when others sought negotiation. In death, he became the thing he always wanted to be: unchallengeable. Yet beneath the hero worship lay contradiction. Wright had claimed to fight for faith, but his violence had blurred the line between religion and revenge. His movement, the LVF, had killed indiscriminately, often targeting civilians with no connection to the conflict. What his followers called defense of Ulster was, to others, moral collapse, the point where ideology dissolved into fanaticism. The cult of Billy Wright divided even the loyalist world. Moderate Unionists saw his image as a stain on their cause, an emblem of everything that had kept Northern Ireland locked in perpetual bloodshed. Churches condemned the idolatry surrounding his name. Politicians distanced themselves, warning that the glorification of Wright kept old hatreds alive long after the war had ended. But the myth endured because it filled a void. In communities scarred by unemployment, loss, and betrayal, Wright's story offered identity. It spoke to those who believed they had fought and sacrificed only to be abandoned by history. His murals became memorials not just to him, but to an entire generation who could not reconcile peace with purpose. Every retelling of his death deepened the legend. Loyalists insisted he had been executed by a conspiracy between the state and Republicans. Republicans saw him as proof of loyalist extremism eating itself from within. The inquiry's findings, that no collusion was proven, satisfied no one. The truth mattered less than the story, and the story had already hardened into myth. In time, the violence he inspired faded, but his image did not. Younger loyalists, born after the Troubles, still wore his likeness on shirts and flags. To them, Wright was not history, he was identity, defiance made permanent. In that sense, he achieved a kind of immortality, yet his legacy is a mirror of the conflict itself, built on conviction, sustained by fear, and destroyed by its own contradictions. Wright's life ended inside a prison designed to contain the hatred he helped unleash, and his death became the rallying cry for those unable to let it go. To some, he remains a defender of faith. To others, a fanatic who destroyed his cause from within. His story ends where it began, trapped between loyalty and delusion, conviction and chaos. In the end, his monument is not victory. It is futility, carved into walls that still bleed old colors in a country still haunted by the men who refuse to stop fighting.